Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a slightly different video. I usually post my transfer plans looking ahead to the next game week, but actually my plans are obviously very chip strategy dependent, and it is actually based on a wild card. So I'm not only even looking at one transfer, two transfers, but more so actually a multitude of transfers. But I'll also talk about, why I'm going for certain picks when I show my wild card drafts and what I think could be useful as free transfers for your team later on if you're interested in that sort of topic of discussion of sort of strategy for the short term. Another thing that I'll mention too is that I am planning to Gameweek 26 wildcard, but I'm also going to plan towards a free hit 34. But I'll also talk about why I'm gambling for certain outcomes to happen and why my team doesn't necessarily look like what you would expect to be a conventional free hit 34 team. On top of that, I'll be explaining, why I'm wildcarding, which is of course the situation of my team, right? Right now, I'm at around 1,000 in the world, or the top 1,000 in the world, at a rank around 618. This, of course, depends on the future sort of outcomes, which are basically the double game weeks between City and Liverpool still to go. Unfortunately, I'm down 2 players, which is going to be between Darwin and Jota. Jota's definitely out for 2 months, whereas Darwin, of course, had a scan during this week, which means that it's very unlikely, in my opinion, that he plays versus Luton. Although, of course, Liverpool, we've also heard some rumor news about Salah being out. So maybe there's a small chance if Darwin and his scan was all good that he could maybe feature, let's say, off the bench versus Luton. That's a realistic situation, but I don't have my hopes up. And the reason why I've also done this is because I pursued a strategy where I invested my transfers into Virgil van Dijk and Jota and basically tried to dead end my team as much as possible because I didn't like the look of my Gaming26 team. And I saw this as a convenient opportunity to get points on the door early, particularly at a fixture opportunity where my team was already looking extremely bad, right? I had Chelsea players in terms of Colwill and Palmer. I had Tottenham players in Richarlison and Porro. Porro also injured. I had Trent injured the week before that, which meant that I had to force another transfer for Trent in Gaming 25, which also meant that either I could pursue a transfer for Trent to, let's say, a double game weeker and try to dead end around that, or I could, of course, pursue a slightly delayed and maybe strategy that would leave me behind some other managers by going for maybe someone like Saliba. Now, of course, the outcome is that Arsenal did extremely well. Saliba got his clean sheet. Even someone like Odegaard in the midfield has clearly done better than Jota. But the reality, of course, is you bet on outcomes, I think, on FPL. And there was obviously going to be a world where I believe that Jota could have done extremely well if you played the full game in Brentford as expected, and potentially as well a little bit of the Luton game. And of course, it hasn't turned out as such, but that's life. As far as Virgil van Dijk, he's still to go, and I've got 3 City players as well, so not too worried about my team in terms of Gaming 25, but we can now focus on Gaming 26. And the reason why, as I said, I wanted to get points on the doors for Gaming 26 is because my rolling team for Gaming 26 would have been so awful that I probably needed to do a -12 or a -16 to get to 10 players for Gaming 26, which I find to be quite ridiculous. Like, I'm probably not going to benefit from that much so. And also, as I said, there was a convenient opportunity to dead end on 25. As a result of this, I'm going to be pursuing a wildcard in Gaming 26. What we need to understand, though, is wildcard in Gaming 26 is not a piece of strategy or a strategy choice that I would recommend to everyone. I've created a specific chip strategy video for all types of managers that actually encapsulates all the different sort of wildcard routes that you can go for, which includes wildcard 27, 28, wildcard 26, which is my strategy, wildcard 30, 31, and also wildcard 35 as well. So do feel free to check out the chip strategy video, which should be somewhere around the exclamation mark at the top. But the key thing there, of course, is that I've already explained the chip strategy. I don't think it's necessary to explain why I've pursued this one in that much detail. So that's all I'm going to say. As far as obviously a final wildcard draft selection, that will be my final team selection for this week. So if you're watching this video, let's say later on in the week, and you're looking for the most updated wildcard draft, that will obviously be my final team selection, which will also come out at the end of this week. But this is a chip strategy, and these are drafts that I think are close already to my sort of best solution for a wildcard. And I think it should give you a little bit of food for thought in terms of how you want to plan your team and how you want to gamble. I've talked about gambling. Now, obviously, I don't endorse gambling, but I think this is a situation where technically we are gambling on fixture outcomes. And this is the reality of the Gaming 26 wildcard, right? If you wildcard on Gaming 27, you wouldn't have to do this because you would know how the fixtures are laid out, and you would find out if there's any crazy or upsets, even upsets that I didn't necessarily plan for. Now, what I have here is a sort of spreadsheet here that illustrates the sort of scenarios that we can possibly have. This was really kindly created by a friend of mine who you can find on FPL Twitter, FPL_Spaceman as well. He's created the graphic. The simulation analysis was done by Analytic_FPL, and of course the data was provided by SpreadX. Now, the projected number of fixtures, as you can see here, is very interesting, right? Because right now we only have 3 confirmed fixtures for like Game Week 29. So if you scroll over to Game Week 29, there's actually 3 fixtures that we think is absolutely confirmed, and that's already going to happen because of the FA Cup outcome so far. So Fulham versus Spurs will definitely happen, West Ham versus Villa will definitely happen, and Burnley versus Brentford will definitely happen. So of course you can kind of look at those fixtures and say that's actually quite a good fixture for, you know, Aston Villa, Spurs, and Brentford. So why not invest into those players as well? So that's definitely, I think, the first point of argument that someone can make, and I think that's true. We can definitely invest into those teams. In my opinion, it actually calls into question whether we should invest into any of the other teams, because I think with West Ham, Fulham, for example, or even Burnley, I'm much less likely to be inclined to actually invest into some of their picks, with exception to maybe Areola, just because he's cheap. As far as the projected number of fixtures, though, as you can see, what Spaceman has done here is that he's actually simulated the scenarios in terms of our understanding of betting outcomes, right? And sort of reproduce what we expect to be the amount of fixtures that we would actually find to happen once all these FA Cup fixtures are played after Game Week 26 and after its deadline. So it's very clear that actually the amount of fixtures we expect to have is actually more so within the range of 4 to 6. As you can see, that's where the higher likelihoods are. It's very unlikely that we'll get 7 fixtures, very unlikely that we'll get 8, and also extremely unlikely that we'll get 3. So we're basically living within that range of 4 to 6 fixtures. What does that mean? I think what that means is that those 4 to 6 fixtures will most likely come through, I would say, upsets and outcomes that we expect right now that could be quite probable. So the likelihoods of those scenarios where we have 4 to 5 or 6 fixtures are shown just above here. And as you can see, the most likely scenario is actually one where we have 4 fixtures and actually Luton versus Nottingham Forest is included. Then the most likely scenario is where Man United versus Sheffield United will play. And the interesting thing here, of course, is that Man United face Nottingham Forest in the FA Cup. If Man United lose, then immediately that Man United versus Sheffield fixture will actually continue. Now, if Luton versus Nottingham Forest, let's say, happens, that's most likely because Luton would have lost to City in the FA Cup and Nottingham Forest would have also lost to United in the FA Cup. Now, our expectations, of course, is that United would beat Nottingham Forest in the FA Cup, but I also think that this is actually the closest matchup in terms of the level of opposition between the 2 FA Cup teams in terms of upset potential, which is why obviously you can see that the Man United-Sheffield United situation or likelihood where there's 4 fixtures and one of them is the United one is actually sort of appearing there. Then, of course, the other sort of less likely scenarios are going to be related to other upsets, like let's say whether Wolves versus Bournemouth is going to happen, Crystal Palace versus Newcastle is going to happen, or Arsenal versus Chelsea. So that's what I'm going to say first. Clearly, it does make sense to bet towards these more probable scenarios because as you can see, it's much less likely that Liverpool are going to lose for Southampton or that City would lose to Luton and Brighton would also lose to Wolves. So that would be what it takes for us to get Liverpool players on the door and also Man City players. So clearly, of course, when we're drafting a Wildcard 26 team, we should probably ignore City and Liverpool with exception to Haaland, right? Because of course, Haaland is sort of our premium here and it still makes sense to go with him and then maybe transfer him out later down the line, potentially swap him for Salah, and I'll explain that in a moment. So that's basically our understanding of Game Week 29. And as I said, it makes sense to me to actually start to bet for certain outcomes. So we know Wolves versus Bournemouth, that's 1. United versus Sheffield, that's 1. Luton versus Nottingham Forest, that's 1. And what are the pool of players that we want from these fixtures? In my opinion, Luton versus Nottingham Forest, we've got Doughty. In terms of Man United versus Sheffield United, I think we actually have the Man United midfielders and potentially Dalot. In terms of the Wolves versus Bournemouth fixture, it's clearly the Wolves midfielders in terms of Hwang and Neto, and potentially even a Wolves defender. In terms of Bournemouth, it's actually all the players that will actually play that we'd probably likely have anyways because of Game Week 28. There's a double Game Week 28 between Bournemouth and Luton, and that's probably why if you wanted 3 Bournemouth players now, I'd probably recommend easily to get Neto, the goalkeeper, Solanke, the striker, and of course another defender, someone like Senesi, for example, or Zabarnyi. Now, if we wanted to look at another game, of course, Arsenal versus Chelsea, I would just say go triple Arsenal because if Arsenal versus Chelsea was to happen in Game Week 29, why does it matter in terms of Chelsea? You probably don't want your Chelsea assets playing versus Arsenal. So what I would say is actually the assets that you want from this Arsenal versus Chelsea game are the triple Arsenal assets. So that's basically the assumptions that I have. And now let's quickly move on to my first wildcard draft. Before we actually jump into the draft, I'd actually like to encourage you guys to subscribe. The support has been absolutely incredible lately. Obviously, A lot of it is rank related, and I really appreciate the support as well. I'm trying my best to push up in FPL ranks, but we're also trying to make sure that our strategy here can actually sustain itself long term. Obviously, there's a gamble here involved in Gameweek 26, but that's not the reason why we're wildcarding here. I think there's a very logical reason given the position that I put myself sort of knowingly within my team. So anyways, that's basically the short preamble before the video. Do feel free to like and subscribe, and even drop a comment on your thoughts on the video as well whilst you're at it. So my first wildcard draft is actually going to be one that is a little bit safer. And the reason why I say it's a little bit safer is because it guarantees you more players on Gameweek 29 based on the confirmed slate. What I would be going with here is Neto and Flecken. The reason why we go with Neto is, as I said exactly with Bournemouth, because they're going to be playing in Gameweek 28. Right, as a double. So Neto, of course, is your confirmed double Gameweek 28 keeper. And then Flecken, of course, is your player who basically is guaranteed to play on Gameweek 29. So for me, Flecken is someone that you can choose between, let's say, Martinez and Areola, just because these are the keepers right now that we know are confirmed to play. And you probably want to pair someone up with Neto, who's still unlikely to play and feature in Gameweek 29 right now with, as I said, one of these players who's going to be confirmed to play. Another core strategy piece that I have is going with potentially double Arsenal. And the reason why I want to go with double Arsenal in terms of the defense is I think it's easier to keep an Arsenal defender in your team because they're less likely to be requiring a transfer out. Because Arsenal defense is so good right now that I would actually say quite confidently that I'd rather have a blank game week player who doesn't play at all in Saliba in Game Week 29 than actually go with someone like Soufal or Zuma in West Ham. But another comparison would be, let's say, a Burnley defender, for example, or even another Brentford defender that's not Reguilon. I think Reguilon is a choice for me to pick because, of course, I think he might be one of the Brentford defenders with a little bit more upside compared to most. So that's what I think about Saliba, and that's why I think he deserves to stick in this draft, because even if Saliba has to guarantee me a blanker in Game Week 29, I would still keep Saliba through this entire run, and I'm totally comfortable, even though that I'm planning for 3 at 34, to have a slightly bad Game Week 29, because the reality too is that I'm having a really good Game Week 26, and all the other fixtures around Game Week 29, I still have a very strong squad. Pau Torres is another player that I would suggest. I think here, of course, this is a choice between either Pau Torres, who I think is quite nailed right now, compared to another player like, let's say, Alex Moreno. If you're confident, for example, that Alex Moreno is not going to lose significant minutes to Dean, if you're confident that he's going to start permanently over Luka Dean, then of course, go for Alex Moreno. But I can't make that justification. I can't make that claim. I think Pau Torres is more likely going to withstand more minutes, and I think Pau Torres is the player that I would go with right now, even though Aston Villa defense doesn't look particularly appetizing. The next pick that I'll be going with here is Senesi and Doughty. Now, a lot of people will probably be asking, like, why go for both Senesi and Doughty here? And I think the reason why I'm saying this is because of all the defenders that we can actually go with on Game Week 26, unfortunately, both Porro and Udogie are injured. So the next likely scenario where you want them is Game Week 27. And I don't think we can even confirm that they'll be back for Game Week 27, although I think Udogie will most likely be ready, whereas Pedro Porro won't. I myself, if I was actually to pick 3 Spurs players to go until Game Week 33, would prefer to have Pedro Porro over Udogie. And I think I'd rather save a free transfer in the future and sort of book it to go for Pedro Porro later down the line than actually go for Udogie in my team. So that's sort of my thoughts right now in terms of Senesi and Doughty. The reason why I'm going for Senesi and Doughty is because I don't want to book too many transfers in advance for double Game Week 28. I want to be prepared for it already, and therefore I think this is just a good opportunity here. As I mentioned as well, it's very likely that Luton versus Nottingham Forest will actually continue to happen as a fixture on Game Week 29, because I still think that it's very likely that both Luton and Nottingham Forest lose their games, and as a result of that, you'd get Doughty as a player on Game Week 29, which I think, of course, is a huge benefit. On top of that, if we go towards the midfield now, we've got Saka, Hwang, Fernandes, Son, and Douglas Luiz. I know a lot of people will be raising questions and raising their eyebrows over Bruno Fernandes. I'm suggesting Bruno Fernandes if you have a little bit more money in the bank. However, I also think that you can simply go Garnacho. So if you can go Garnacho here and you prefer Garnacho, I would probably actually recommend that you go for Garnacho. But that's basically a personal preference thing. I think Fernandes is someone who can still do well in FPL. I believe in my penalty takers at times, and that can go really poorly, as it has basically all season long for Bruno Fernandes. Or, of course, you can just enjoy what Garnacho is, who's an incredible asset right now with incredible underlying stats. Right now, you have someone like Garnacho who, if I was to compare it to Bruno Bruno is much more expected assist dominant, much less expected goals per 90, whereas Garnacho actually has a lot of expected goals per 90 and still relatively decent expected assists per 90, particularly for his price point. I think Garnacho is probably one of the crazier steals in the game alongside Palmer, if we just, took away the blank fixtures and that element of FPL planning. So those are my thoughts in terms of Fernandes and Garnacho. I probably am likely to go Garnacho because I like the idea of saving money in the bank. But for now, I'm going to illustrate that Bruno Fernandes is someone that you can go with within your draft structure. And of course, you can downgrade to Garnacho anytime you want. On top of that, I think you can go for Hwang here. And in my opinion, I think Hwang is absolutely nailed in this wildcard draft, along with Saka, Gabriel. Those sorts of players like Neto as well, I think are absolutely confirmed. So if I was sort of to revisit the draft at this stage, just between the midfield, defense, and goalkeepers, I think Neto is 100% locked. I think Gabriel is 100% locked. I think Pau Torres or an Aston Villa defense, just that sort of position in the team is 100% locked. Saka, Hwang, and Son right now are absolute locks for me. And the reason why I like Hwang and Son so much, of course, is that you're guaranteeing penalty takers between, let's say, Wolves and Tottenham. And on top of that, just Hwang just has a ridiculous fixture slate right now for Sheffield United. I also think that his underlying stats are extremely good for a midfielder. If you look, for example, at my cheat sheets, you'll notice that someone like Hwang actually has ridiculous expected goals per 90 compared to the rest of the field in FPL. So he very much deservedly becomes a sort of pick here in this draft. And even though Wolves vs Bournemouth is very likely to be a blank fixture in Gameweek 29, I would still recommend Hwang over even someone like a Bowen right now, just because of the price sort of difference, and also I simply think he's a better asset. We all obviously could believe that maybe Hwang isn't on penalties necessarily. Penalties could also belong to Sarabia, but I think that he's actually someone who clearly wants penalties. If you've read anything into, for example, the Asian Cup penalty that he took over Son, it's very clear that he wants to be a penalty taker. And I think it's more likely that Wolves and Gary O'Neill in particular will allow Hwang to continue to be the penalty taker in Cunha's absence. On top of that with Son, I think right now the issue that we're seeing with Richarlison is that the minutes are starting to drop. We also don't have enough money in this draft to really go for a double premium structure. I also don't think it's necessary to sort of invest in that, particularly because Salah and Haaland are very likely to blank in Gameweek 29. As a result of that, of course, Son is basically the best sort of, I would say, half premium pick almost. And he very much deservedly belongs to this draft because we're also gearing for a free at 34 strategy. And of course, if I was to pick between Son and Richarlison and price wasn't an issue, I would clearly go with Son. In this draft here, I've actually gone with a slightly safer pick here in Douglas Luiz. And part of that, I think, is because if you think that the chances of upsets are quite low and you're still a little bit cautious in terms of the amount of fixtures we're actually going to get, clearly, of course, you want more outfield players, within this team here that are basically confirmed to play in Gameweek 29. And Douglas Luiz is clearly one of those players. So that's why I like Douglas Luiz, and that's why I put him in this draft. I still think that he is someone who, just because he's on penalties, and even though he's going to play a little bit deeper now as an Aston Villa player, I think that he's got good enough fixtures and he has decent enough underlying stats, particularly even, for example, his expected assists through set pieces, that he's still going to be a relatively reasonable pick that you can actually say is going to deliver you FPL points in the long term. So I like Douglas Luiz as an option here. In terms of the front line, I've actually gone with Tony, Haaland, and Watkins. Now, a lot of people will be asking the question, why is there no Solanke? And in my opinion, whatever draft you go with in the forwards, there's going to be an issue. And the issue is going to be you have to transfer out, in my opinion, once again, Haaland out for Gameweek 28. Now, this might not be the case, and you might not necessarily need to do this transfer if there's a miracle situation, as I said, and let's say, I don't know, Man City still have a game to play in Gameweek 29, but I think it's so likely because Gameweek 28 is a bad fixture for Man City. It's probably their worst fixture this season outside of Arsenal away. It's Liverpool away. So, in my opinion, it's a good game week to take Haaland out of your team on Gameweek 28. And it's most likely going to be Haaland to Solanke on this situation. But of course, if you were to go Solanke right now, I think Tony has to be the player who actually falls out of the squad. And then what you'd have to do is on Gaming 28, you'd have to go Haaland to Tony. So then the question in my mind becomes Tony versus Solanke for 2 weeks, Game Weeks 26 and Game Week 27. Solanke has one of those fixtures being Man City. And I think it's an easy call here. I would go with Tony for 2 weeks, preceding, for example, Game Week 28, where you'd bench Tony anyways, and then go Solanke for Haaland on Game Week 28, as opposed to you go for Solanke from the start here with Game Week 26, and then you suddenly go Haaland to Tony just to bench Tony, for example, or go Haaland to Adebayo for whatever reason, maybe because, of course, there's a confirmed fixture there, and play along those lines. In my opinion, as I said, because I think Tony's going to be very useful to me in Game Week 29, I still prefer Tony as a pick here, and I would definitely go with Tony, Haaland, and Watkins within my draft structure, and I think it's very interesting and very convenient. Another thing to talk about here with the first draft structure, though, is that Game Week 26, even if we count the amount of Game Week 29 players here, it's actually not as high as you'd expect, and I have to explain that 2 of the transfers out of the next 3 transfers that we'll have are planned towards players who obviously play for Gaming 29. And that's going to be Pedro Porro and either Richarlison or Maddison. And that would also allow us to go for Gaming 30 to go for Salah. So here are the transfers that I would suggest if you were to pursue this sort of strategy. So assuming that, let's say, Luton and Nottingham Forest is the only fixture that would actually happen on Gaming 29, and we get that confirmed on Gaming 27, what I would do in Gaming 27 is simply just transfer out Bruno Fernandes here and move him towards Richarlison. So that would be the first transfer. Then what I would do on Gaming 28 is go from Haaland to Solanke. So that's going to be the second transfer. On Gaming 29, the final transfer that I would do is to actually take out one of Senesi or Doughty into Pedro Porro. Assuming that Doughty plays, I'll probably be taking Senesi out of my team, and that will mean that I'll actually have Pedro Porro in place of Senesi, obviously, Richarlison in place of Fernandes, and of course, Haaland replaced by Solanke, who's also still a blanker. So if we were to count the amount of players we'd have for Gaming 29 now, this would be Flecken 1, Pau 2, Pedro Porro 3, Doughty 4, Son 5, Richarlison 6, Douglas Luiz 7, and then Tony and Watkins 8 and 9. So this would be just 9 players here within this draft structure. And personally, I think that this is more than good enough to survive Gaming 29 whilst also not trying to kill my team for the rest of the season, because we still have to plan for Gaming 37. And the way Gaming 37 will work is that by free hitting on 34, we get to ignore 3 at 34 completely, and we get to spend the rest of our transfers from effectively Gaming 30 and beyond to plan for whoever actually has really, really good doubles for Gaming 37 for the bench boost. And if, let's say, Salah has the double in Gaming 37, then all we need to do is really go on Gaming 30 towards Salah. And that's simple as that. If we wanted to keep Haaland, then we can just go back to Haaland, in my opinion, and just do a hokey-cokey there. No issues, no stress. In terms of the second draft here, though, this is more aggressive, but I also like it because I actually think that I back some of the players here in the short term a little bit more. And I also think that Martinez as a goalkeeper is probably an upgrade over Flecken, which is something that I quite like. So the only change here is the change in keepers between Martinez and Flecken, and then also the change here between, let's say, the two midfielders in terms of Douglas Luiz and Garnacho. So as I mentioned, we're probably going to assume that Man United might not get the upset that we want, or might not get upset as we'd like. Here, of course, we're sort of going all in on Man United and gambling that they lose to Nottingham Forest. Now, I know this sounds counterintuitive. We're investing into Man United players, but we're also hoping that they lose in the FA Cup, which probably shows that they're not a very good team, and then hoping that their attackers get to stay in our team. Now, the reality, I think, is that, of course, if that investment pays off, you get 2 Man United attackers versus Sheffield United, which, of course, is an incredible situation, and, of course, we're in Wonderland. The key, of course, is that we are down 1 more player here for Gaming 29, and we'll probably only have 8 players by Gaming 29, which, of course, is a problem, but I don't think it's a gigantic problem because, as I said, if let's say we take the best assumptions for the predicted scenarios, it's very unlikely that we have 11 players that are amazing for Gaming 29. And if we do have 11 players that are amazing for Gaming 29, it's very likely that some of these players here that I've mentioned that will not play in Gaming 29 will play on Gaming 29 anyways. Let's say Leeds upset Chelsea. Suddenly, I've got 3 other players within Arsenal that will be ready to play versus Chelsea, which actually, in my opinion, is still a good fixture to have because it's Arsenal at home. If I suddenly have a Newcastle upset, I think that this is where both of my drafts struggle, right? If they get Newcastle versus Crystal Palace, I don't actually have a Gordon, I don't have a Trippier, but I might be able to change my transfers around that. Maybe let's say instead of going for Pedro Porro, I can go for Trippier instead on Gaming 27. That could be an interesting transfer, but we'll obviously be able to know once we find out. I also think it's more ridiculous that Blackburn would upset Newcastle just because Blackburn are still probably one of the worst teams in the championship, and that's the reality, right? Newcastle still aren't that bad. So that's sort of my assumption here. And obviously, if you get the United upset versus Nottingham Forest and they get knocked out of the cup, perfect. You've got 2 other players here that would add into your team, and suddenly we've got 10 players, even if we disinclude the Arsenal players. So that's why I'm sort of angling for free at 34. I still think it's very likely we'll land between 4 to 6 fixtures. I still think that some of these players here, even though in the worst case scenario they might not play, I've got 7 players on Gaming 26 here. And the difference is going to be Garnacho versus Douglas Luiz, where, of course, Garnacho is more less likely to play in comparison to Douglas Luiz, who's obviously going to play no matter what. So this is the sort of landscape here. I think that we have the chance to bet, and I'm going to bet on some of the easier upsets to go with, and I'm going to ignore Liverpool and City for now, with exception to Haaland, of course. And that's it. That's basically going to be the wildcard draft. I think it sets you up really well in the short term because you'll basically be really well set up for Gaming 28, and all you need to do is book 1 transfer in advance for Solanke. In terms of Gaming 26, obviously you've got an optimal squad and a squad that looks very good. Maybe you can actually go for more Wolves players, or let's say you want to go Odegaard, for example, with triple Arsenal, you could obviously just reduce Saliba to someone that could be a Wolves punt, right? Let's say you go for a Wolves defender, you go for Ait Nouri, or you go for Kilman or Dawson. You could obviously switch this around and maybe go for Odegaard as well. That could be something to think about in the midfield. Let's say you don't like Fernandes and Garnacho. So obviously, if you want to replace Fernandes and you don't care about Fernandes and drop number 2, that could very well be Odegaard, and your punt in the defensive position could easily be, let's say, changing Saliba into Ait Nouri, and you can punt on Wolves on their amazing fixture versus Sheffield United at home. So those are the kind of options that I have in my mind, and I'll be sort of playing around this and kind of going with the draft structure. As I said, I'm expecting upsets. This is the reality of football. I don't think every single overdog within Gameweek 26 within the FA Cup will actually win in the Premier League. So that's the reality of things. I'm expecting for 4 to 6 fixtures, and we'll bet around that. I don't think there's a special need, for example, to go for West Ham players, because I just think that West Ham players are pretty poor assets, and that could really hamper your team in the short term between Gameweek 26, even leading up to Gameweek 29. So why even bother doing it? And those are my thoughts right now. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. And hopefully it'll be a shorter video, but this will be a good video to sort of explain my full thought process on Gameweek 26. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and take care and goodbye.